It's my pleasure to be here to introduce our last panel for today and to introduce our speakers, each of whom will help us explore daily life in the American West. Specifically, these papers focus on cultural production by and about Asian American communities as they navigate both domestic and public spheres. As these scholars will show us, that the study of periodicals, photography, and material culture can flesh out how Asian Americans made lives in the American West and how they employed reproductive media to shape their own narratives, even as Anglo-American photographers or writers attempted to shape those stories for them. I'm really pleased to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Susan Eberhard. She's a visiting assistant professor at Swarthmore College. Susan is an art historian of early, modern, and modern China in a global context. She focuses on decorative art and material culture. Her research and teaching take post-colonial, feminist, and comparative approaches to how knowledge about art is constructed and circulated. Susan's book project is titled Metamorphic Medium, Materializing Silver in Global Early Modern China. Please join me in welcoming Susan.
Thank you so much, Diana, and I want to thank our organizers, Fla and Todd, for organizing this incredible, amazing symposium. So without further ado, I'll start. I have a little bit of a title change here to draw attention to the key word that you'll be hearing throughout my talk. So it's now called Picturing the Trans-Pacific Life, Labor, Leisure, and Death of Gonging Louise. Life dates 1868 to 1909. So in the single extant portrait of Gonging Louis, the subject is positioned in a three-quarter view, her soft, even gaze directed to the viewer's right. A strong light source above her catches on the shininess of her taut, oiled hair and emphasizes the angularity of her cheekbones. Her face is clear and in full focus, unlike the top face of the double dial calendar clock that sits on the table beside her. The clock serves as the formal double to her face. Historians and theorists of photography have long remarked on the medium's special relationship to time, which in Roland Barthes' terminology in camera lucida, the photo's referent is that has been. When looking at a photograph, a viewer confronts the historical contingencies of a moment that once came to be and no longer is. How can this photograph help us picture the life, labor, leisure, and death of a Chinese immigrant woman to the American West? And I'll just add that most of the primary sources that I drawn for this talk are located at the Cal Poly San Luis Obispo Special Collections and Archives, but I've omitted that throughout most of the PowerPoint just for space sake. Gonging is known to us primarily today as the wife of Louis, recognized as the most successful Chinese merchant and labor contractor on California's central coast. The Louis family lived on Palm Street in San Luis Obispo, California, along with one other Chinese family and a fluctuating population of Chinese migrant laborers. It is hard to overstate Louis' importance, both material and imaginative, in the history of San Luis Obispo, where he was regarded as a pioneering businessman and pillar of the now mostly historical Chinese community. Both Gonging and Louis immigrated from the Taishan region of Guangdong province to California, though they met and married in San Francisco in 1889. Among his many business endeavors, Louis owned a general store, and the family lived in the second-floor apartment. Both Gonging and Louis, the building still stands today. This is a photo taken probably in the last year or so. It is recognized as a historic building, and a party store currently rents the space. And now this is where things turn a little tragic. So in the second floor of this building in 1909, Gonging was murdered in her sleep by a gunshot to her head. She was 39. Two of her children were in bed with her. The police investigation concluded that the murderer was Louis' eldest son from his first marriage, who lived with the family. Willie Louis was jailed in San Quentin and later executed. Several motives were discussed in newspaper accounts of the investigation and trial, but the true motive for the murder remains unclear. So in this talk, I analyzed Gonging's portrait using archival evidence of her life and afterlife, and evidence revealed from family testimony surrounding her death at rest. Recently, scholars have traced the contradictions and claims that are specifically embedded in historical portrait photographs of Asian immigrants in the Americas. Curator Stephanie Tung has called for the witnessing of the presence of now anonymous immigrant Chinese women through photographic portraiture. Tung has written that it is rare for Asian women to be, quote, pictured or even rendered visible, unquote, in 19th century America. In an article about this rare daguerreotype of a Tangke or Shangchuiren woman, Tung argues that the subject's confident gaze projects her presence as a political claim. I would add that her protective grasp of an additional portrait daguerreotype in a case on the table next to her serves as what Barthes would describe as an umbilical claim, perhaps to a family member or child who was absent either because they died or because they were in China. Most Chinese immigrants remain tied to their home villages. Photography could unite families over long distances, just as it could preserve the memory of someone who had passed. From the standpoint of a photographic image, the difference between distance and death of the subject pictured is blurred. Compared to the subject of the previous photograph, we know relatively more about Gaoning due to the fame, status, and self-archiving activities of her family. Yet absence unavoidably structures the picture we have of her. And I'm reminded of Elizabeth Fair's question for the first panel about how absence has informed each of their work in the archive. In this talk, I argue that this photograph should be viewed within three trans-Pacific contexts, three trans-Pacific frameworks. First, its subject's life story. Second, from the standpoint of genre. This photo might look familiar to some of you because of its genre. And third, within the Louis family's construction of a trans-Pacific photographic archive of family. I use the term trans-Pacific rather than transnational in order to emphasize the cross-oceanic trajectory of Chinese migration rather than the boundedness of migrants within state borders. So in this part of my talk, I will do my best to partially reconstruct the trans-Pacific biography of Gaoning Louis based on the surviving evidence of her life, much of which is revealed through the discursive production surrounding her death. What can this photograph reveal of her life story? So while this photograph is undated, it was taken when she was still a young woman. It comes alive through the spare memories of her children. Son George recalled how she used to sing lullabies to him. Quote, "I loved to cuddle up to her and run my hands over her face, which was velvet, soft, smooth, and pearly white. It was beautiful like jade. Everybody admired the beauty of this extraordinary, strong, and lovely person. My Mexican friends used to come into the store and murmur, 'Que bonita,' how pretty," unquote. George's memories of his mother primarily recalled her physical presence through touch. He gives us a view of how people outside the family saw her, as a beauty, as singular, and as strong, but also as a prized wife, with certain qualities of her appearance objectified. In the photo, she was also demonstrating her wealth and her married status with rings on her ring fingers. Her right ear is adorned with a silver and jade earring. Her wrists are heavy with stacks of silver and jade bracelets. In Gaoning, her name, meaning silver dove, was born in a southeastern Chinese village called Sang'an in Guangdong province in 1868. She was in San Francisco by age 19, where she met and married Louis, a man of about 50. There were very few Chinese women in California compared to men, And in 1855, less than 2% of the Chinese immigrant population in California were women. Due to the conditions of her marriage, she could have been a daughter of another Chinese merchant, or either a prostitute or an enslaved female domestic whom Aloy essentially purchased when she came of marriage age. There's a real possibility she could have been a picture bride. We just really don't know anything about her life before her marriage. So it's almost as if that is when her life began. After their marriage, Gong returned with Aloy to a central California village of San Luis Obispo, where she bore 10 children, 8 of whom survived infancy to adulthood. While her life was inevitably full of life, it was intensively constricted. In his testimony for the murder investigation, her husband revealed that she had only left their apartment twice in 20 years, only to go to a dentist and another time to visit the home of the Tomasinis, a white rancher family. Confirming this decades later, her eldest son, young Luis, said that she considered it proper to devote herself solely to her home and children, rarely venturing from the family living quarters above the store. That was a quote. The upstairs space was partitioned into 6 rooms, which included space for an ancestral altar. Gong duties confined her to this space, caring for her family, washing, cooking, and perhaps hosting guests. It might be hard to believe, but staying at home was considered the proper and indeed only place for the wife of a Chinese immigrant merchant, and it was common for them to remain in an upstairs apartment. The assumption for women like Gong is that she would remain out of public view. In a way, she seemed to haunt the 2-story brick building even during her life. Gong, being someone of relatively high class for Chinese immigrant women, lived a relative life of leisure. In her important social history of Chinese immigrant women in San Francisco, Judy Young used the term, quote, women of leisure, end quote, to describe the very few wives of merchants who lived a life at home. Most Chinese immigrant women worked either as sex workers or enslaved domestics. As the wives of laborers, another category, they worked in laundries, as seamstresses, shopkeepers, or as laborers themselves, in addition to their care work at home. Yet, unlike merchants' wives, they could go out, and of course we've seen this image already, to the temple, to the market, as depicted in Theodore War's painting, New Year's Day in San Francisco, Chinatown. They did not interact, however, with men or stay out for long. In the street, they're at risk of racial and sexual assault. Women are also conspicuously absent from Western genre paintings, publicly depicting men at leisure in San Francisco's Chinatown, such as War's Chinese restaurant. Women's leisure happened in private, or their lives were defined by the, quote, leisure, unquote, of class. We are offered a rare glimpse into this private space through the breathtaking moment of Gong's murder, which revealed her at a moment of rest, as well as publicized her significant personal wealth. The investigation of her death initially focused on the, what later turned out to be staged, theft of her tin box of jewelry and money, which papers reported totaled $2,000 in value, which equates to over $70,000 today. Her personal resources raised the question of how she accrued it, as well as what her plans and aspirations were for her future. Did she plan to invest her wealth in property, business, or charity? Did she intend to retire to China in glory, as her husband later attempted in his 90s? In other words, did she have trans-Pacific aspirations for her own return? How did she think about her own past and imagine a future? Gong traveled very far and then not at all for 20 years. She lived a life of leisure that was also one of constant reproduction and domestic labor. After she died, her body reversed course. Her eldest son, Young, accompanied her to San Francisco, where she had been married, and then her bones were sent back to her village for burial, completing her trans-Pacific circuit. As much as her photograph is a portrait of an individual, it is more and even overwhelmingly so a portrait of a social type. Ing is accompanied by a silver water pipe, a tablecloth, a silver spittoon, a fan, and other luxury goods. She is posed in a very specific way. Three-quarter turn toward the viewer, one hand resting on a table, the other on her lap. While there are photography studios in St. Louis, due to the specificity of the pose and requisite objects, it seems possible this photo was taken in San Francisco, by a photographer who specialized in a portrait of Chinese sitters. Perhaps it was taken at the time of her marriage in 1889. With a ring on her finger and her wedding jewelry, was it a wedding portrait meant to mark her new social status? This composition was repeated again and again in Chinese photographic portraiture of the period. The representations of elite Southern Chinese women shows them as moral subjects of means, a type of idealized personhood, as demonstrated by the image on the right, also taken in California. While we don't know the year that Gong Ying's portrait was made, it nevertheless indexes its subject to her American setting at a specific yet unknown time, therefore operating as a trans-Pacific image where honorific Chinese portraiture conventions were deployed in an American context. The classic formulation of portrait photography is that it can serve honorifically to elevate its subject's social importance, or repressively through systems of state or ethnic classification and control. Anna Pegler-Gordon has argued that photographs that served as identity documentation for Chinese immigration in the US did both at once. The Guri Act of 1892 required Chinese people to carry identification, and it was the first time that the US government required a group of people to prove their legal residence. The act assumed that all Chinese were legal immigrants and all Chinese women were prostitutes unless proven otherwise. Chinese women used studio portraits as identification photos, which drew on the construction of a bourgeois moral subject to prove they were not sex workers. Gong Ying's photo could and likely did at some point in her life serve this purpose, though we don't know. Within overlapping trans-Pacific contexts of social and state control, this photograph, like other photographs of Chinese women, operated multivalently. Julia Lum has shown how photos of Chinese immigrants to Canada, some of which were identification photos, or photos in the service of narratives created to facilitate immigration, also serve to construct transnational family bonds and memory. So now let's shift perspectives one more time to consider how to place this portrait within the Louis family's construction of a trans-Pacific photographic archive. So when Louis returned or immigrated to the US in 1861, his plan, which was shared with many southeastern Chinese migrants, was to make his fortune and return home to his village to retire in glory. He made the trip in 1932 to 1933, accompanied by his two youngest sons, Toby and Fred. Toby documented the trip through long, lively letters of their experience and photographs, which he compiled into albums upon his return. The photos visually document the family's voyage to China, their visits with family and friends in the commercial cities of Hong Kong, Guangzhou, and Shanghai, and the brothers' travels as tourists to visit the ancient cities or sites of Nanjing, Hangzhou, and other cities. They also offer us a glimpse into Louis' home village of Lang'an and the events that transpired during their trip. Together, the materials offer a singular perspective on a complex trip, at once an ongoing family reunion, the adventures of young Chinese-American tourists in modernizing China, and the glorious yet ultimately ill-fated retirement of a successful overseas Chinese father and businessman. Ultimately, Louis decided to return to California. The photos construct a trans-Pacific view of a multi-generational, multi-continental family. In one photo, Fred Louis stands with his 54-year-old Chinese half-sister, Ah Duk, the daughter of Ah Louis' first wife, who had remained in China. Both are wearing Chinese dress appropriate for village elites. A large framed photo of Ah Louis taken on the trip in China is hung above a small table on which several objects were placed. What at first glance could be 3 generations, descending from right to left, is in truth 2, as they are half-brother and sister. On opposite sides of the Pacific, Ah Louis' children led drastically different lives shaped by migration. The materials also contain some appearances of Gongyin, hauntings that reveal aspects of her life, toil, and agency beyond narratives of state control or family harmony. First, Gongyin appears as a ghost during the trip to Ah Louis. As Toby wrote in a letter to his siblings, quote, "At one point, Dad dreamt that he saw Mama, and she made a couple strokes of her beard, indicating that he should let his own beard grow. And now, after a month or so, it is about an inch long. He won't part with it," end quote. She also appears to her sons mediated in the guise of another woman they meet, the wife of Apan, the second son of their half-brother and mother's murderer. This is a very complicated image, but it's kind of a stand-in for the fact that this enormous and incredible archive, I do not have a picture of Apan's wife, however, Apan is pictured here. As Toby Louis wrote to his siblings about Apan's wife, who does all the work at the schoolhouse that Ah Louis had sponsored in their village, at the house of the mother of Willie's first son, at Apan's house itself, quote, "Nobody but Apan's wife, who resembles our mother to no little end. She's been kicked around so much, she automatically goes to another room whenever our family gathers to talk," end quote. Apan's wife is also the only person in their extended family who prays at their mother's grave. Toby and Fred see their mother reflected in the overworked figure of a woman who's used as a servant in their family, and who undertakes her moral obligations. Finally, while in China, the brothers transformed Gonging's portrait into a ceramic portrait for her gravestone. In one of his letters, Toby writes, "Fred is going back to the village in a couple of days to see how Mother's tombstone turned out. We are having her portrait hand-painted onto a porcelain disc that is baked 4 times to preserve the colors and lines for years and years," end quote. The porcelain painter was likely working off of the photo, cropped to just include Gonging's face, and this image actually appears in the contact prints created of the negatives that were undeveloped from Toby's 1930 photos. Ceramic portraits and photo ceramics were popular among Chinese consumers since the turn of the 20th century. They were used as ancestor portraits mounted onto tombstones. The vitrification of the firing process was important. It affected a permanence of the image that would be reflected in the immortality of the subject's soul. So to this time, the family was likely already using Gonging's portrait as an ancestor portrait, but the trans-Pacific movement of the photograph and its cross-metal transformations bring together the image and her physical body, showing how the photo presence, absence, and absence, presence. So in conclusion, I've used this portrait photo to consider the trans-Pacific movements, both material and immaterial, of Gongyin Louis. My analysis aims to link her life story with the social life of a photograph. And it also shows how tracing the contingencies that arise, that make up an individual life, can animate global processes. Through Gonging's absence, death, and afterlife, we are offered a partial presence of what that has been. Thank you so much.